Under the blazing afternoon sun, Nia Taylor strode through the chaotic pulse of the city, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, its strap snug against her frame. Her steps were deliberate, each one landing with the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced far worse than a crowded urban street. A former Navy SEAL, Nia carried the weight of her training in every movement, her posture unyielding, her sharp eyes sweeping the surroundings with practiced precision. The city's hum, a blend of honking cars, distant chatter, and the rhythmic slap of her sneakers against the pavement, faded into the background. She was grounded, focused, her mind honed to filter out noise and zero in on what mattered. Civilian life might lack the clear-cut dangers of her past, but it had its own irritations, ones she navigated with the same steely discipline that had carried her through missions most could only imagine. Across the street, Greg Thompson lounged against a graffiti-streaked wall, his laughter cutting through the city's din like a jagged blade. Flanked by his buddies, Paul and Ryan, he exuded a brash arrogance that seemed to demand attention. Their voices were loud, grating, a stark contrast to the steady flow of pedestrians around them. Greg's eyes locked onto Nia as she passed, his laughter dying for a split second before a smirk curled his lips. "Yo, check her out," he said, nudging Paul with an elbow. "Now that's something worth a closer look." Paul's grin matched Greg's, his gaze trailing Nia's confident stride. "Yeah, strutting around like she's too good for this place," he said, his tone thick with mockery. Ryan, the youngest of the trio, let out a nervous chuckle, his eyes flickering between Nia and Greg. "Bet she's one of those uppity types," he added, his voice tinged with unease. "Thinks she's untouchable." Nia didn't falter. Their words, sharp and taunting, were nothing new, just another layer of noise she'd long since learned to ignore. Her focus remained ahead, her body language betraying no hint of concern. But her senses were razor sharp, cataloging the shift in their tone, the subtle edge of aggression creeping into their banter. "She's not even gonna look over here," Greg said, his smirk widening as he pushed off the wall, his posture loosening with predatory intent. "Maybe we ought to teach her some manners." Nia caught the movement in her peripheral vision. Greg stepped forward, the way Paul and Ryan mirrored him, but she kept moving, her pace steady. Her mind, however, was already mapping their positions, tracking the rising threat behind their words. "Hey, sweetheart," Greg called, his voice louder now, slicing through the street's clamor. "You in a hurry, we're just trying to be friendly." The taunts grew bolder, their voices echoing off the concrete walls of the surrounding buildings. "Come on, don't be rude." Paul jeered. "You can't even say hello." Their laughter swelled, a harsh grating sound that followed her like a shadow. Nia's eyes narrowed slightly, but she gave no outward sign of reaction. She wasn't about to let their baiting pull her into a confrontation, not yet. Still, she knew this wasn't going to end with them staying put. Their footsteps quickened, the gap between them closing as they trailed her down the busy street. "Hey, don't be shy," Greg called, his tone mockingly sweet. "We're just trying to have a conversation. Isn't that what polite folks do?" Paul chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's got her nose so high, you'd think she's royalty or something." Ryan, emboldened by the others, added, "Bet she's one of those stuck-up types, acting like she's better than everybody." Nia's stride remained even, her body language calm, but her senses were on high alert. Their voices grew louder, their steps more purposeful. Greg edged closer, his presence impossible to ignore. "You're not even going to say thank you," he said, his tone laced with mock offense. "We're giving you all this attention. Most people would kill for that." Nia's expression didn't shift, but she subtly adjusted her stance, distributing her weight evenly. "Ready for anything. I didn't ask for it," she said, her voice low and sharp, cutting through their bravado like a blade. Greg's grin widened, a dangerous glint sparking in his eyes. "Oh, she's got some fire," he said, gesturing to his friends. "Look at that. Finally got her to talk." "Come on, sweetheart," Paul said, stepping closer from the side. "No need to be rude. We're just saying you look nice. Don't act like you don't love it." Ryan, his confidence growing, added, "Yeah, we're just trying to get to know you. Why you gotta be like that?" Nia stopped abruptly, forcing the trio to halt in their tracks. Her head turned slightly, her piercing gaze sweeping over them. Greg, Paul, Ryan one by one. The air seemed to thicken, their smug grins faltering for a heartbeat under the weight of her stare. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "But here's some advice: back off before you regret it." For a moment, their confidence wavered. Ryan's eyes widened slightly, his bravado flickering. But Greg recovered quickly, his grin twisting into something darker. "Oh, we're the ones who'll regret it," he mocked. "That's cute," Paul laughed, his voice rough, big talk for someone all alone. Greg leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Thing is, sweetheart, we don't back off. Maybe you need someone to show you how the world really works." The street seemed to narrow around them as Greg stepped directly into Nia's path, forcing her to stop. Paul and Ryan closed in on either side, their arrogance palpable, their laughter cruel and unrestrained. Greg planted himself firmly in front of her, his smirk now a full-blown sneer. "See, this is what's wrong with people like you," he said, his tone venomous. "Walking around like you own the place, like everyone else is beneath you." Nia's eyes narrowed, but her calm never wavered. "People like me," she repeated, her voice like ice. "Yeah, you know what I mean," Greg snapped, stepping closer. "Think you can do whatever you want just because the world feels sorry for you?" Paul laughed harshly, piling on. "Bet you were raised to act like you're better than everyone." Typical, Ryan, feeding off the escalating tension, added, "What? You think you're some kind of queen, strutting around like you're untouchable?" Nia's jaw tightened, but she held her silence, her gaze moving between them, assessing. Greg wasn't done. "Bet you're the type who screams racist the second someone looks at you wrong." He sneered. "Let me guess you'd call the cops if we even said boo. Wouldn't you?" Paul smirked, his voice thick with mockery. "Yeah, run and cry for help. Isn't that what you people always do?" Nia's eyes flashed, but her voice remained steady, cutting through their taunts like a whip. "The only people crying for help are the ones who don't know when to stop." Greg's smirk widened, his arrogance only growing. "Oh, you think you're tough? Think you can handle this on your own? You're all the same act, all strong, Isom. But you break the second someone pushes back." Paul nudged Ryan, laughing. "She probably thinks she's too good to be scared of us." Ryan's bravado faltered for a moment, his voice quieter. "Maybe we should just—" Greg cut him off, his attention snapping back to Nia. "Shut up," he barked at Ryan before turning to her, his grin twisting. "You know what? Let's see how tough you really are. Why don't you hand over that bag? Maybe then you'll learn a little respect." Nia didn't flinch, her body still in control. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice even but laced with a warning that sent a chill through the air. Greg chuckled darkly, stepping closer as Paul and Ryan mirrored his movements. "No, sweetheart," he said. "The mistake was thinking you could walk past us like you're better than we are." Without warning, Greg lunged for the strap of her bag, his fingers outstretched. But Nia was faster. Her arm snapped out, deflecting his hand with a sharp, practiced motion that sent him stumbling back, his face twisting with shock and anger. "What the hell," he barked, flexing his stinging hand. Nia didn't respond, her stance shifted, her mind already calculating her next move. Staying here, surrounded by a crowd, risked escalation, and she had no intention of letting this spiral out of control in public. Paul, fueled by Greg's failure, moved toward her next, his approach clumsy and overconfident. Nia sidestepped him with precision, her balance flawless, before breaking into a sprint down the crowded street. "She's running," Ryan shouted, his voice high-pitched and panicked. After her, Greg snapped, shoving Paul forward as he took off in pursuit. Nia's feet pounded the pavement, her breath steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The crowd parted as she moved, her focus locking onto potential exits. Behind her, The men's voices grew louder, their footsteps hammering the ground in a chaotic chase. "Where are you gonna go?" "Huh?" Greg yelled, his voice thick with mocking rage. "You can't run forever." Paul's taunts followed, sharp and relentless. "Come on, lady. Stop making this worse for yourself." Nia veered sharply into a narrow alley, the tight space forcing her pursuers into a single-file line. The walls closed in, amplifying the sound of their heavy breathing and pounding feet. She pushed forward, her instincts kicking in as she scanned her surroundings for an advantage. "She's fast," Ryan wheezed, already falling behind. "She's cornered," Greg snarled. "She just doesn't know it yet." Ahead, a chain-link fence blocked the alley. Nia's eyes flicked to it briefly before she adjusted her course, darting into another, smaller alley. This one was a dead end, walled off by crumbling brick and littered with dumpsters and debris. Nia stopped, turning to face the mouth of the alley, her body poised and ready. The men's footsteps slowed as they approached, their laughter replaced by heavy breaths and the scrape of shoes on gravel. They thought they had her trapped. They were wrong. In the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, Nia stood resolute at the mouth of a narrow alley, her breath even, her piercing gaze fixed on the shadowed entrance. The air was thick with tension as three figures emerged, their silhouettes sharp against the faint light. Greg stepped forward first, his wide grin radiating smug triumph. Nowhere left to run. "Sweetheart," he taunted, his voice dripping with menace as he closed the distance. Paul trailed close behind, his smirk brimming with arrogance. All that running, and for what he sneered. Ryan lingered at the rear, his uneasy grin betraying a flicker of doubt, though he still muttered, "Told you we'd catch her." Nia stood tall, her posture unshaken, her eyes locked on Greg with an intensity that could cut through steel. "You boys have no idea what you've just stepped into," she said, her voice calm yet laced with a chilling edge that sent a shiver through the air. Greg's harsh laugh echoed off the grimy walls, his bravado unshaken. "Stepped into you're the one who's done. You've got nothing left." Paul cracked his knuckles, inching closer with a predatory glint in his eyes. Time to teach her a lesson in respect. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as Nia subtly shifted her stance. Her muscles coiled like a spring ready to unleash. The men, blinded by their own arrogance, failed to sense the quiet power emanating from her. Greg lunged first, his hands outstretched to seize her. With the grace of a dancer, Nia sidestepped, her movements swift and precise, causing him to stumble forward. As he spun to face her, her knee rocketed upward, connecting with his side in a clean, devastating strike. Greg grunted, staggering back, pain flashing across his face. "You've got some nerve," he spat, clutching his ribs, his pride fueling his resolve. Paul didn't hesitate, charging in with wild, clumsy swings. Nia ducked under his first punch, stepping inside his reach to deliver a sharp elbow to his ribs. He gasped, doubling over. But before she could capitalize, Greg roared back, slamming his shoulder into her from behind. The impact nudged her forward, but Nia twisted free, her elbow snapping back to catch Greg's jaw. He stumbled sideways, cursing under his breath. Paul, fueled by frustration, recovered and swung again. His fist grazed her cheek, but Nia rolled with the blow, minimizing its sting. In retaliation, she landed a quick jab to his midsection, followed by a sharp kick to his shin that sent him retreating with a grimace. Ryan hovered at the edge of the fray, his movements hesitant, his eyes flickering between his comrades. "What are you waiting for?" Greg barked, steadying himself against the alley wall, spurred by the command. Ryan lurched forward, his nervous energy driving a sloppy rush. Nia met him head-on, her hand darting out to seize his arm mid-swing. With a sharp twist, she bent his wrist at a painful angle, forcing a cry from his lips. A swift kick to his knee sent him sprawling to the ground with a thud. Greg, now livid, charged again, aiming to overpower her. Nia leaned into his momentum, redirecting his weight to send him crashing into a rusted dumpster, the metallic clang reverberating through the alley. Paul seized the moment, landing a punch to Naya's side that sent a dull ache through her ribs. The pain only sharpened her focus. She spun, grabbing his arm and yanking him forward, driving her knee into his stomach. Paul collapsed, gasping for air. Ryan scrambled to his feet, trembling but unwilling to flee. Greg, pulling himself upright, wiped a smear of dirt from his face, his voice low and venomous. "You're not walking out of here." Paul, clutching his side, nodded grimly. "She can't take all three of us." Greg motioned to his companions, his eyes never leaving Naya. Together this time? Nia's breath remained stirred, her sheer gaze unwavering as she sized up her battered but still dangerous opponents. They circled her like hungry wolves, their egos blinding them to their own vulnerability. Greg charged first, his movements reckless. Naya waited until the last moment, stepping aside and sweeping her leg to trip him. He crashed to the pavement, his hands slapping the ground in frustration. Paul followed, his fist flying in rapid, aimless strikes. Nia ducked and weaved, her movements fluid as water, landing another elbow to his ribs. Paul staggered, his balance faltering. Ryan, pushed by Greg's sharp command, stumbled forward reluctantly. Naya deflected his grab, countering with a precise kick to the back of his knee that sent him crumpling again. Fury overtaking him, Greg snatched a splintered piece of wood from the alley floor and swung it wildly. Naya's sharp eyes tracked the makeshift weapon. As it arced toward her, she stepped back, letting him overcommit. Darting forward, she seized the wood mid-swing, wrenching it from his grasp and tossing it aside. Greg froze, stunned. "Think this is a game," he growled, his face contorted with rage. Naya's response was swift, a knee to his stomach that left him doubled over, gasping. Paul, desperate, made one final charge. Naya sidestepped, striking the back of his knee, sending him sprawling beside Greg. Ryan, pale and shaken, scrambled up. "This isn't worth it." "Greg, let's go." Greg, pushing himself to one knee, glared at Nia, his face flushed with humiliation. "Fine," he spat, limping toward the alley's exit with Paul and Ryan in tow. "But you'll regret this." Nia watched them retreat, her breathing controlled, her stance unyielding. Yet as the adrenaline ebbed, a steely resolve settled in her chest. Letting them walk away felt like a mistake. Men like these didn't learn, they simply found new prey. Her jaw tightened as she adjusted her gym bag strap. "Not this time," she whispered. Without a second thought, Nia broke into a sprint, her sharp eyes locked on the trio as they vanished into the bustling crowd beyond the alley. The chase was far from over. Her footsteps were swift, weaving through pedestrians who parted instinctively at her approach. Ahead, Greg, Paul, and Ryan shoved through the throng, their earlier swagger replaced by frantic urgency. Their rough passage drew glares and muttered complaints from passers-by. "She's still coming," Ryan shouted, his voice cracking as he glanced back, his face drained of color. Nia's strides were relentless, her expression unreadable but fiercely focused. "Keep moving," Greg snapped, his tone sharp with irritation. But Ryan's eyes flicked back again, and the sight of Nia closing in made him stumble. Paul grabbed his arm, yanking him forward. "Stop slowing us down. You want her to catch us?" Nia remained silent, her breathing steady despite the exertion. Her SEAL training guided her every move, analyzing their erratic patterns, searching for openings to close the gap. The trio veered down a side street, their movements growing sloppier. Nia followed without hesitation, her eyes scanning the quieter surroundings, parked cars, scattered debris, and the echo of footsteps in the narrow space. Greg slowed briefly, his head whipping around to gauge their pursuer. His jaw clenched as he saw Nia, still trailing them, relentless as a shadow. "She's not stopping," he muttered, frustration boiling over. "Let's split up," Paul suggested, his voice high with panic. "She can't follow all of us." Greg shot him a glare. "No, we stick together. She's just one person." Ryan, lagging behind, groaned. "One person who took us all down." Ignoring him, Greg led them into a tighter alley, its walls lined with graffiti and overflowing dumpsters, his eyes darting for an escape. Nia paused at the alley's entrance, her lips pressed into a thin line. They were boxing themselves in without realizing that. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. "You're only making this worse. Stop running and face me now." Her words echoed, hanging in the tense silence. A final warning to the hunted. The tight alleyway seemed to constrict around the trio, its looming walls amplifying the unease rippling through them. Ryan's steps faltered, his pace dragging as his chest heaved with labored breaths. "Don't listen to her," Greg barked, his voice taut with urgency, cutting through the damp air. "Keep moving," Nia, relentless, quickened her stride behind them, her footsteps echoing louder as she narrowed the distance. They were running out of room to flee, and she wasn't about to let them slip through her grasp again. The alley spat them out into a cluttered back lot, its cracked pavement strewn with splintered pallets and forgotten crates. Greg took the lead, his movements growing erratic as he scanned for an escape. Paul and Ryan stumbled after him, their ragged gasps betraying the toll of the chase. "She's too close," Ryan wheezed, panic cracking his voice. "We need to split up." Greg whirled on him, eyes flashing. "No way. We stick together. She's not getting us." Under his breath, Ryan muttered, "She's already beaten us once." But he kept it low, wary of Greg's temper. Nia entered the lot with measured steps, her sharp gaze sweeping the uneven terrain and scattered debris. She didn't rush. Every move was deliberate, her focus honed on the trio's stumbling retreat. Her eyes tracked their every misstep, reading their exhaustion like a hunter sizing up prey. Ahead, Greg spotted a jagged gap in the chain-link fence at the lot's far end. There he shouted, shoving Paul forward. Ryan lagged behind, his legs heavy, until his foot snagged a loose board. He crashed to the pavement with a sickening thud, his knees scraping against the rough surface. "Get up!" Paul yelled, his voice tinged with desperation. Ryan clawed at the ground, gasping, "I can't! I'm done!" Greg shot a glance back, his face twisting with frustration. "Fine. Stay here if you're useless." Paul hesitated, torn, his eyes darting between Ryan and Greg. "We can't just leave him." Greg's patience snapped. "We don't have time." He grabbed Paul's arm, yanking him toward the fence. Ryan lifted his head, panic flooding his chest as he watched his friends vanish through the gap. Then he saw her, Nia, closing in with steady, deliberate steps. "Stay back!" Ryan shouted, his voice weak as he scrambled to his feet. His legs wobbled, but he raised his fists in a shaky attempt at defiance. Nia stopped just out of reach, her expression cold and unyielding. She could see the fear in his wide eyes, the way his trembling hands betrayed his bravado. "Don't do this," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're not going to win." Ryan's breaths came in short, frantic bursts, his fists tightening. "You don't scare me," he lied, his voice hollow. Nia stepped closer, her movements smooth and precise. "I'm giving you a chance to stop before you get hurt again. Take it." For a fleeting moment, Ryan hesitated, his arms lowering as doubt crept in. But desperation surged, and he lunged, swinging wildly. Nia sidestepped effortlessly, her reflexes sharp. In one fluid motion, she seized his wrist, twisted his arm behind his back, and forced him to the ground. Ryan yelped, his resistance crumbling under her strength, pinned to the cold pavement. He groaned, his voice shaking. Okay, stop. I give up." Nia held him firmly, her grip unyielding. Leaning down, she said softly, her voice like ice. "You didn't need to fight, but you made your choice." Ryan's face pressed against the pavement, his gasp muffled as Nia reached for her phone with her free hand. Her movements remained calm as she spoke to the dispatcher. "This is Nia Taylor. I have a suspect detained in a back lot near 5th and Carter Street. He's involved in an attempted robbery and assault. Send officers immediately." Ryan groaned beneath her. "You don't have to do this," he mumbled weakly. Naya ignored him, her eyes scanning the lot. Spotting a rusted metal railing nearby, she decided it would do. Still pinning Ryan, she pulled a length of paracord from her gym bag, a habit born from years of training. Ryan squirmed as she hauled him to the railing. "What are you doing?" he whined, panic lacing his voice. "Making sure you stay put," Nia replied curtly. With practiced efficiency, she bound his wrist behind his back and secured him to the railing. Ryan tugged at the cords, but they held fast. "Come on," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "I already gave up. Just let me go." Nia crouched in front of him, her gaze icy. "You don't get to decide how this ends. You're lucky I don't have time to deal with you myself. The police will." Ryan's shoulders slumped, his face a mix of defeat and fear as he sagged against the railing. Satisfied he wasn't going anywhere, Naya stood, adjusting the strap of her gym bag. Her eyes flicked to the gap in the fence where Greg and Paul had fled. They were still out there, and she wasn't done. "You made your choices," she said coldly, glancing at Ryan one last time. "Now you'll face the consequences." Without another word, she sprinted through the gap, her focus sharpening as she picked up their trail. Faint footsteps and muffled voices reached her ears, urging her forward. Greg and Paul might have thought they'd escaped, but Naya was far from finished. The hunt was still on. She moved swiftly through the narrow alley beyond the fence, her eyes scanning the dim, shadowed path. The city felt quieter here, the distant hum of traffic dulled by towering buildings. Pausing at an intersection, she crouched to study scuff marks on the pavement, erratic footprints in a toppled trash can signaling their growing panic. They were running blind, and that gave her the edge. Ahead, Greg and Paul stumbled into another alley, their steps uneven as they glanced over their shoulders. "She's not going to stop," Paul muttered, his voice strained. "I told you we should have split up." Greg shot him a glare, his breath ragged. "You think that would have helped? She's toying with us. We stick together, and we'll figure it out." Paul's face paled, fear etching his features. "You don't get it. Greg, she's not normal." Greg grabbed his arm, his voice sharp. "Enough. Just keep moving. We'll lose her." Naya, trailing silently, closed the gap with calculated precision. Her sharp eyes caught glimpses of their shadows as they rounded another corner. "Running won't help," she called out, her voice slicing through the narrow space. Greg froze for a split second, his grip on Paul tightening. He turned toward the sound, frustration twisting his face. "You want to scare us? It's not working." Paul tugged at his arm. "Let's go. We can't just stand here." But Naya was already closing in, her steps deliberate and swift. Greg cursed and shoved Paul forward, their movements growing more frantic. They darted down another alley, but their panic was betraying them. Naya followed at a steady pace, her breathing even, her senses attuned to their chaotic retreat. The alley opened into a small courtyard, hemmed in by tall brick walls. Greg skidded to a halt, his eyes darting for an escape. "We can climb," he muttered, pointing to a rusted fire escape on the far wall. Paul hesitated, his hands trembling as he eyed the shaky ladder. "I don't think I can make it." Greg's patience snapped. "You don't have a choice." He dragged Paul toward the wall, but Naya stepped into the courtyard just as Greg's foot touched the ladder. Her presence stopped them cold, her calm demeanor radiating authority. "This is over," she said, her voice carrying unshakable finality. Greg's face contorted with anger as he let go of the ladder and turned to face her. Paul shuffled back, his wide eyes flicking between them. Nia's gaze locked onto them, unflinching. Greg stepped forward, positioning himself between Naya and Paul, his jaw clenched. "Stay back," he barked, his bravado faltering. "You think you're tough. You're nothing." Nia didn't reply, her steady advance unnerving them more than words could. Paul's breathing grew frantic. "Greg, we need to go," he hissed, tugging at his sleeve. "Then go!" Greg snapped, his eyes darting to the courtyard's exits. "You're slowing me down." Paul's face twisted in shock. "You're just gonna leave me." Before Greg could answer, Naya moved like lightning, recognizing Paul as the weaker link. She surged forward, her movements a blur of precision. With a well-timed leap, She tackled him to the ground, driving the air from his lungs. Paul gasped, flailing beneath her grip. "Get her off me," he shouted, his voice breaking. Greg's resolve crumbled as he took a step back. His fists clenched, but his feet rooted in place. Nia's grip on Paul was unrelenting, her focus absolute. The courtyard seemed to shrink around them, the rusted fire escape a mocking reminder of their failed escape. Greg's face paled, his bravado evaporating as he realized the game was up. Nia's voice cut through the tense air, calm but commanding. "You're done running. Both of you." The hunt had ended, and Nia stood victorious, her unwavering determination bringing the chase to a close. In the dim, flickering light of the alley, betrayal hung heavy in the air. Greg's voice trembled as he muttered, "You're on your own," his words barely audible over the pounding of his boots against the cracked pavement. He didn't look back, his figure swallowed by the shadows as he fled toward the alley's mouth, leaving chaos in his wake. Paul's desperate cry pierced the night, "Don't leave me!" His voice cracked with panic as he twisted toward Greg's retreating form, his struggles growing wilder. But Greg was gone, his footsteps fading into the distance like a ghost escaping into the dark. Nia, unyielding, kept her focus locked on Paul. He writhed beneath her, his movements frantic, his breath ragged. Her grip was iron, her voice cold as steel. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her tone steady despite the sweat beading on her brow. Paul swung weakly, his fist grazing her arm but lacking the strength to connect. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice a mix of fear and defiance. Nia caught his neck swing with ease, twisting his arm behind his back in one fluid motion. She forced him to the ground, his cheek slamming against the cold, gritty pavement. A sharp cry of pain escaped him as his resistance began to crumble. "Stop struggling," Nia commanded, her voice leaving no room for debate. "It's over," Paul groaned, his face pressed into the dirt, his defiance reduced to a weak mumble. "You're crazy," he muttered, his words muffled by the pavement. Nia's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You'll have plenty of time to think about that when the police get here," she replied. Tightening, she adjusted her hold to ensure he couldn't slip free. The distant echo of Greg's retreat faded, leaving only the sound of Paul's uneven breathing and the faint hum of the city beyond the courtyard. Nia's mind was already racing ahead. Greg might have slipped through her fingers tonight, but he wasn't untouchable. Not if she had anything to say about it. With one hand keeping Paul pinned, she reached for her phone, her movements precise despite the fatigue creeping into her muscles. The chase, the fight it had pushed her to her limits, and her body ached with the effort. Still, her breath remained steady as she dialed, her voice sharp and composed when the dispatcher picked up. "This is Nia Taylor. I've detained a suspect involved in an attempted robbery and assault. I'm in a small courtyard off Van Marshall. Send officers now." Beneath her, Paul let out a low groan, his cheek still pressed against the pavement. "You think this changes anything?" he muttered, his voice thick with resentment. "You're just wasting your time." Nia's gaze flicked down to him, her expression as cold as the night air. "You're lucky I don't have the energy to deal with you the way you deserve," she said, her tone clipped. Paul let out a bitter laugh, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, big talk. What are you, some wannabe hero? You think you're better than me?" "I don't think," Nia shot back, her voice low and cutting. "I know." Paul's face twisted with anger, and he squirmed weakly beneath her. "You're nothing," he spat, his words venomous. "Just some stuck-up woman who thinks she's tough. Nobody cares. You think those cops will do anything they won't. They'll pat you on the back and let Greg walk free." Nia's jaw tightened, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, she adjusted her grip on his arm, ensuring he couldn't move. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" she said, her voice like ice. "You talk big for someone eating dirt." Paul sneered, his voice laced with disdain. "You got lucky. That's all. Greg's the smart one. He's gone, and you'll never find him. People like you don't win. You're just a speed bump." Nia leaned in slightly, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. "You think running makes him smart? All it does is delay the inevitable. And people like you, you're the reason I won't stop. Not until every last one of you is exactly where you belong. Paul glared at her, his mouth tightening into a thin line, but he had no response. The fight was draining out of him. Moments later, the faint wail of sirens cut through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. Nia straightened, keeping Paul restrained as the sound filled the courtyard. "You can say whatever you want," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "But you're done. And Greg, he's next." Paul's shoulders slumped, his defiance finally crumbling as the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser illuminated the courtyard. The siren cut off abruptly, leaving only the low hum of the engine as the car rolled to a stop. Two officers stepped out, their faces calm but cautious as they approached. Nia stood at the center of the courtyard, her body screaming with exhaustion. Her ribs throbbed where Paul had landed a weak punch earlier, and the scrape on her arm stung, leaving a faint smear of blood on her skin. Despite the pain, she held herself tall, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The older officer, a tall man with a graying mustache, approached her directly. "You called this in?" he asked, his tone professional. "Yes," Nia replied, her voice steady but tinged with fatigue. "This is the second one I caught." She gestured to Paul, now cuffed and slumped against a rusted railing, his glare a mix of fear and resentment. The other one, Ryan, was tied up further down the alley. "Your team already took him in earlier." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So that just leaves one, Greg, right?" Nia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, he ran when I tackled this one. He's the leader, and he's dangerous. You need to find him before he hurts someone else." The second officer, a younger woman, crouched to check Paul's cuffs. "Looks like you've been through a lot tonight," she said, glancing up at Nia. "You okay? That's a nasty bruise on your cheek." "I'm fine," Nia said curtly, though the ache in her ribs and the burn in her legs told a different story. "The priority is Greg," Paul chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Greg's too smart for you. He's long gone." Nia's gaze snapped to him, cold and unyielding. "If he's so smart, why are you here? He left you behind, didn't he?" Paul's smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Doesn't matter, you won't catch him. The cops won't either. They don't care enough." The older officer sighed, pulling out a notepad. "We'll need your statement," he said to Nia, his tone professional but not dismissive. "Every detail helps." Nia nodded, moving slowly toward a nearby bench. Her legs felt like lead, and her ribs protested with every step. She lowered herself onto the worn wood, her body aching but her resolve unbroken. "Fine," she said quietly, launching into a detailed recounting of the night's events. She described Greg's arrogance, the way he'd orchestrated the robbery with a cocky grin, Paul's desperation, his wild swings and panicked shouts, and Ryan's hesitance, the way he'd crumbled under pressure before she'd even laid a hand on him. The officers listened intently, jotting down every detail, ensuring no nuance was missed. When she finished, the younger officer looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "You've done more than most people would," she said. "But you look like you're in rough shape. Are you sure you're okay?" Nia nodded, though her voice carried a note of weariness. "I'll live, Basse. Just find Greg. He's the one you need to worry about." The older officer gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll put out an alert. With Ryan and Paul in custody, we'll have more to work with. But these things take time." Nia's jaw tightened, though she forced herself to relax. The night had taken its toll, but her determination hadn't wavered. "Make sure you do your job," she said evenly, "because if you don't, I will." The officers exchanged a glance before securing Paul in the cruiser and heading back to their vehicle. As the sound of the car faded into the distance, Nia leaned back against the bench, her head resting against the cool brick wall behind her. Every ache in her body seemed sharper now that the adrenaline had worn off. Her ribs throbbed with every breath, her cheeks stung where Greg had struck her, and her scraped arm bore a faint smear of blood. But her mind was still sharp, fixed on one thing: Greg. He might have slipped away tonight, but this wasn't over. The quiet courtyard settled into an uneasy stillness as the police cruiser disappeared into the night. Nia's sharp gaze drifted to the alley where Greg had fled. Rushing after him now would be reckless, but she wasn't out of moves. The police had Ryan and Paul in custody, and while they might not prioritize Greg, she could use the two she'd caught to force their hand. Her thoughts flickered to the brief exchanges she'd had with Paul, and Ryan both had cracked under pressure. Ryan with his panicked surrender, Paul with his desperate bravado. Greg might think he was untouchable, but his so-called allies could lead her right to him. Wincing as her ribs protested, Nia pushed herself off the bench. Her body begged for rest, but her resolve refused to falter. She adjusted the strap of her gym bag and reached for her phone. Dialing the precinct, the officer who'd taken her statement answered, his voice gruff. "Taylor, what's the update?" "I want to help," Nia said firmly, pacing the courtyard as she spoke. "You have Ryan and Paul. I need access to them. They know where Greg is hiding." The officer sighed, the faint sound of papers shuffling on the other end. "We're already questioning them, but these guys don't crack easily. They'll lawyer up or spin lies to waste our time." "Then let me try," Nia pressed, her tone heavy with exhaustion but burning with determination. "I face them directly. They're scared of me, scared enough to slip up. Let me talk to them." There was a pause, the silence stretching as the officer considered her request. "You're not a cop," he said finally. "This isn't standard procedure." "Neither was tonight," Nia shot back. "You know I'm right. I can get through to them faster than you can. Just give me the chance." Another pause, longer this time. When the officer spoke again, his voice carried a note of reluctant agreement. "Fine, we've got them in holding." Nia's grip tightened on the phone, a spark of renewed energy cutting through her fatigue. Greg might have thought he'd won by running, but he'd underestimated her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As she ended the call and began walking toward the precinct, the courtyard faded into the background, its stillness a stark contrast to the fire burning in her chest. Greg was out there, but not for long. She'd make sure of it. Nia's voice cut through the static of the phone call, sharp and unyielding. "You meet me on my terms, or this ends now. I'll be there in 15. She snapped the phone shut, her body screaming in protest as she strode across the shadowed courtyard. Every step sent a jolt of pain through her bruised ribs, a brutal reminder of the night's chaos. But her mind was already racing, plotting her approach. Ryan would be the weak link, his jittery nerves would betray him under pressure. Paul, though, was another story. His cocky facade was a flimsy shield, and Nia knew it would crumble with the right leverage. This wasn't just about tracking down Greg anymore. It was about sending a message to men like him, predators who thrived on manipulation and betrayal, that their time was up. The precinct loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the dim streetlights. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of fluorescent bulbs and the faint clamor of distant phones. The usual bustle was muted, replaced by a late-night lethargy. Officers drifted between desks, some hunched over keyboards, others murmuring over case files. Nia's piercing gaze swept the room as she approached the front desk. The officer who'd taken her statement earlier glanced up, his weary face softening with the flicker of recognition. "Taylor," he said, rising. "They're both in holding. You sure you want to do this?" "Absolutely," Nia replied, her voice steady as iron. She shifted the strap of her gym bag, the ache in her side pulsing but ignored. "Let's move." The officer gave a curt nod and led her through a maze of sterile hallways, their walls cluttered with faded wanted posters and pinned-up notices. They paused outside a holding room, its one-way window revealing Ryan, hunched at a table, his hands twitching like a cornered animal's. "This one's already unraveling," the officer muttered, nodding toward Ryan. "Kid's terrified." Nia's face remained impassive. "I'll start with him." The officer pushed the door open and Nia stepped inside, her presence filling the small room. Ryan's head jerked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You," he stammered, his voice cracking. What are you doing here?" Nia didn't answer immediately. She pulled out a chair, its metal legs scraping against the floor, and sat across from him. her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his barely contained panic. Folding her arms on the table, she fixed him with a steady gaze. You know exactly why I'm here. Ryan, you're going to tell me where Greg is. Ryan shook his head frantically, his trembling hands betraying his words. I don't know. I swear, I don't know anything. Nia leaned forward, her voice low but firm, cutting through his denial. You lied to me once tonight. Ryan, don't dig yourself deeper. You think Greg gives a damn about you. He bolted the second things got hot, left you here to take the fall. Ryan's mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the scratched tabletop. You're scared. Nia pressed, her tone softening just enough to draw him in. And you should be. Greg doesn't care if you rot in here. But you've got a shot to make this easier on yourself. Tell me what I need. Ryan's fingers gripped the table's edge, his knuckles white. He hesitated, then mumbled, He's got a place. I don't know where exactly, but Paul might. Greg trusts him more. Nia's eyes narrowed, her mind filing away the detail. What else, she asked. Does he have a routine, a spot he likes to hide? Ryan swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. He mentioned the docks sometimes. Said the old garages there are good for laying low. But I don't know if he's there now, I swear. Nia studied him for a long moment, then stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. Stay put, she said, her tone icy as she headed for the door. In the hallway, the officer raised an eyebrow. Anything good? He pointed to the docks, Nia replied, her voice even but laced with simmering frustration. Greg might be holed up there. Paul's next. The officer gestured to the adjacent room, where Paul sat behind another one-way window, his posture defiant despite the bruises marring his face. I'll deal with him, Nia said, her jaw tightening. He'll talk. The officer unlocked the door, and Nia stepped into the second holding room. The dim light cast harsh shadows across the bare walls, amplifying the tension. Paul lounged in his chair, arms crossed, his swollen jaw and bloodied forehead doing little to dim his arrogance. Well, he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. The hero's back for round 2. Not tired of this game yet. Nia didn't bite. She slid into the chair across from him, her expression cold as stone. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence press against Paul's bravado. He shifted, his smirk flickering. What's this? The silent treatment, he taunted. You think you're going to intimidate me? Nia's gaze locked onto his, her voice sharp and deliberate. I don't need to intimidate you. Paul, you're already scared, you're just too stubborn to admit it. Paul let out a harsh laugh, leaning back, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Scared of you. Please, you got lucky. That's all. Greg's out there, and you're stuck here chasing shadows. Greg, Nia said, her tone flat as she leaned forward. The same Greg who ditched you without a backward glance, the one who let you take the hits while he ran. Paul's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. Nia pressed harder, her voice cutting deeper. You act like he's got your back, but he used you. Paul used all of you. Now he's hiding, and you're the one staring down the consequences. Paul's hands tightened on the table, his knuckles paling. You don't know what you're talking about, he muttered, but his voice wavered. Don't I? Nia shot back, her tone rising with controlled intensity. The officer's voice was gruff, tinged with reluctance as he leaned back in his chair. Fine, you're next on the line, but you're not going in there solo. I'll have a car stationed nearby, ready to roll the second you give the signal. Nia nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. That's all I need. She pushed off the edge of the desk, her movements deliberate but slower than usual, her body protesting after the grueling night. Bruises throbbed beneath her skin, and every step felt like a reminder of the battles she'd already fought. But her eyes burned with unyielding resolve. As the officer reached for his radio to call in backup, Nia stepped away, pulling her phone from her pocket. Her thumb hovered over the contacts list, pausing for a heartbeat before she tapped a number. Hey, she said when the call connected, her voice softening, carrying a weight of exhaustion and quiet reflection. I just wanted you to know I'm okay. It's been a hell of a night, but I'm handling it. The voice on the other end was faint, laced with worry that carried across the distance. Nia's gaze drifted to the floor, and she nodded, though no one could see. I will. This isn't over yet, but I'm close. I'll call when it's done. She ended the call with a quick swipe, slipping the phone back into her pocket as the officer approached, his boots heavy against the linoleum floor. Backup's in place, he said, his tone clipped. When you're ready, we move. Nia's eyes flicked to the map spread across the desk, its creases worn from hours of scrutiny. She gave a sharp nod. Let's finish this. The low hum of the car engine faded as Nia stepped onto the cracked pavement near the docks. The air was thick with the briny scent of salt water, undercut by the metallic tang of rust. In the distance, boats creaked against their moorings, their rhythmic groans blending with the hush of the night. Shadows stretched long under flickering streetlights, jagged patterns sprawling across the dilapidated warehouses and abandoned garages that loomed like forgotten relics. Nia adjusted the strap of her gym bag, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. Every detail was critical now. The faint groan of metal in the breeze, the scuff marks etched into the dirt, hinting at recent movement. She crouched low, her fingers brushing against a fresh set of footprints, uneven and hurried, as if someone had been running. Greg, her jaw tightened as she traced the faint trail, her steps silent against the fractured pavement. The officer's cruiser idled several blocks back, out of sight but close enough to spring into action. Nia had been adamant about going in alone. A heavy police presence would only spook Greg, sending him deeper into the shadows. The garages at the east end rose ahead, their peeling paint and rusted shutters bearing the scars of neglect. Nia slowed as she neared the first one, her senses razor sharp. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow shifting behind a cracked window. Her breath steadied as she pressed herself against the garage's weathered wall, peering through the broken pane. The interior was dimly lit, a single bulb casting weak light over stacks of crates, scattered tools, and a cluttered workbench. A figure paced restlessly, his movements jerky and agitated. Greg. Nia's eyes narrowed as she watched him mutter to himself, his gestures wild, a heavy wrench gleaming on the workbench nearby. Its placement was too deliberate a weapon within reach. She didn't need to hear his words to sense his panic, his mind racing for an escape. Silently, she stepped away from the window, moving toward the side entrance. The door hung slightly ajar, and she crouched beside it, listening for any signs of life beyond Greg's pacing. The garage was still, save for his restless steps. He was alone. Her phone buzzed faintly in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the officer's message. We're in position. Signal when ready. Nia's fingers moved quickly, typing a reply. Target confirmed. Stand by. She tucked the phone away, her focus sharpening like a blade. Her body ached, each movement a reminder of the night's toll. But she shoved the pain aside. This was it, the final stretch. The cool night air clung to her skin as she crouched beside the door, every muscle coiled with anticipation. Inside, Greg's pacing continued, his muttered curses cutting through the creak of rusted hinges and the distant lapping of waves. Nia pressed her back against the wall, her breathing slow and controlled. Leaning closer to gauge his position, his steps were erratic, pausing as he growled to himself, his voice low but dripping with anger. You think you're smart, huh? Catching those idiots doesn't mean you've got me. You'll never get me. Nia's jaw clenched. His arrogance hadn't faded, but there was a crack in his bravado, a tremor of desperation. Carefully, she nudged the door open a fraction wider, her movement silent. The faint groan of hinges made her freeze. But Greg didn't notice, too lost in his own spiraling thoughts. He paced near a stack of crates, the flickering bulb overhead casting jagged shadows that danced across the cluttered floor. Old tools, broken machinery, and forgotten parts littered the space, the air heavy with the scent of oil and mildew. The wrench on the workbench caught her eye again, its metallic glint a silent warning. Nia slipped through the door, her steps deliberate, her eyes sweeping every corner for hidden threats. Greg froze suddenly, his back to her, his head snapping up as if sensing a shift in the air. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice sharp. Nia didn't answer. She stepped closer, her movements calculated, her breathing steady. Greg spun around, his eyes widening for a split second before narrowing into a glare. "You," he hissed, his tone a cocktail of fury and disbelief. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Nia stopped a few feet away, her stance steady, her gaze locked on his. "You've been running all night." "Greg," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "It's over." Over Greg's hand twitched toward the wrench, his jaw tightening. "You think you're better than me? You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Nia shot back. "I know you let your friends take the fall. I know you're out of moves." His glare deepened, but a flicker of doubt crossed his eyes. "I've got moves you can't even imagine," he snapped, stepping toward the workbench. His fingers closed around the wrench, lifting it with a sharp motion. Nia didn't flinch. "Another bad choice," she said coldly. "You've already lost. Don't make this worse." Greg's laugh was bitter, echoing in the empty garage. "You think I'm afraid of you?" "No," Nia replied, taking a measured step forward. "But you should be." The air crackled with tension as they faced off, the room filled with the sound of their breathing and the faint hum of the flickering bulb. Greg's grip on the wrench tightened, and Nia shifted her weight, ready for whatever came next. His veins bulged as he clutched the wrench, his eyes blazing with defiance but betraying a flicker of unease. The bulb's harsh light cast stark shadows, amplifying the claustrophobic weight of the moment. "You really think you're walking out of here?" Greg sneered, his voice low and venomous. "After everything you've done?" Nia's expression was ice cold, unflinching. "Everything I've done," she countered, her voice steady but edged with steel. "You chased me, harassed me, tried to rob me, and now I'm the problem." Greg's lip curled into a bitter smirk. "You should have kept your mouth shut and walked away. You brought this on yourself." Before Nia could respond, Greg lunged, swinging the wrench in a wide, vicious arc. The metal whistled through the air, but Nia was faster. She ducked low, pivoting on her heel as the wrench sailed past her head. Seizing his overextension, she drove her shoulder into his midsection, sending him stumbling into a stack of crates. The wood groaned under his weight, but Greg recovered quickly, his glare now a blaze of fury. He charged again, feinting left before swinging the wrench in a brutal overhead strike. Nia sidestepped, the weapon grazing her arm, sending a sharp jolt of pain radiating to her shoulder. "You're quick," Greg growled, swinging again, this time aiming for her ribs. "But you're not as tough as you think." Nia blocked the strike with her forearm, the impact jarring her bones. She grimaced but held her ground, countering with a swift jab to Greg's jaw. The punch snapped his head to the side, but he retaliated instantly, slamming the wrench into a nearby crate to throw her off balance. "You think you're better than me," he spat, circling her, his voice dripping with venom. "Strutting around like you own the place, acting untouchable." Nia's stance remained steady, her breathing controlled despite the ache in her side. "Untouchable," she shot back, her voice rising with restrained fury. "I'm tired of men like you thinking you can touch, control, take without consequences." Greg's bitter laugh echoed as he charged again, swinging the wrench wildly. Nia ducked under the first strike, then spun to dodge the second. With a precise kick to his knee, she sent him crashing to the ground, the wrench clattering across the concrete. For a moment, the garage was silent, save for Greg's ragged breathing and the distant creak of the docks. Nia stood over by him, her eyes blazing. "It's over," she said, her voice low and final. "Stay down." With a groan of pain, Greg hit the cold, gritty ground. But he wasn't down for long. His face twisted in a snarl as he grabbed a rusted pipe lying nearby, using it to haul himself back to his feet. His eyes burned with rage as he thrust the pipe toward Nia in sharp, aggressive jabs. each one forcing her to retreat a step. On his fourth lunge, Naya's hands shot up, seizing the pipe with a fierce grip. With a swift twist, she yanked it from his grasp and tossed it aside, the metal clanging against the concrete. "You don't get it, do you?" Greg bellowed, his face flushed with exertion and fury. "People like me, we're always the ones taking the blame, always the ones getting screwed over." "Blame?" Naya fired back, her voice sharp as she squared her shoulders. "You attacked me because I wouldn't give you what you wanted, and now you're trying to spin yourself as the victim." Her words cut through the air, her hands still tingling from the pipe's rough surface. Greg let out a guttural roar, his frustration boiling over. He swung a wild punch at her, his fists now his only weapons. Nia's forearm snapped up, deflecting the blow, and she countered with a lightning-fast uppercut that sent him stumbling backward. Not letting up, she swept his legs out from under him with a powerful kick, knocking him off balance. "You hate being called out," she said, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "You can't stand hearing no. Men like you think the world owes you everything that you can act without consequences." Greg scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. Fainting to the left, he suddenly lunged, tackling Nia into a stack of wooden crates. The impact splintered the crates, sending shards of wood scattering across the floor. Pain shot through Naya's bruised ribs, but she clenched her teeth, refusing to falter. Twisting beneath him, she drove her elbow hard into his side. Greg yelped, his grip loosening just enough for her to break free. She rolled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing ache in her ribs, and faced him again, her stance unyielding. "You think this is about you?" she said, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "Your ego, your power, your need to control. It's not. This is about every woman who's had to deal with scum like you." Greg's eyes blazed with rage, and he charged again, throwing frantic, sloppy punches. Naya moved with precision, ducking and weaving as she let him tire himself out. When he overreached with a particularly reckless swing, she saw her opening. Stepping in close, she drove her knee into his stomach with brutal force. Greg crumpled to the ground, coughing and wheezing, his hands clutching his midsection. He tried to crawl toward a nearby wrench, but Naya was faster. She stepped firmly on his hand, pinning it to the floor. "Don't," she said, her voice ice cold. Greg glared up at her, his defiance flickering like a dying flame. "This changes nothing," he muttered, his voice hoarse and strained. "You think you've won? You're just another loudmouth trying to take what's not yours." Nia crouched down, her face inches from his, her eyes burning with intensity. "What's not mine?" she said, her voice low and lethal. "My safety, my dignity, my humanity. Those were never yours to take." Greg had no response, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to breathe. Naya stood, pulling out her phone with steady hands. "This is Nia Taylor," she said when the dispatcher picked up. "I've got the final suspect detained at the docks. Send backup." As Greg slumped against the ground, his fight draining away, Naya stood over him, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. The faint wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the docks. The flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser illuminated the scene as it pulled up outside the garage. Two officers stepped out, their footsteps quick and purposeful. The older one, who Nia had spoken to earlier, scanned the scene with a practiced eye. "Nia," he called, his voice calm but firm. "You okay?" She straightened, wincing slightly as her ribs protested. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone steady. "He's the last one." The officer nodded, stepping inside with his partner, their boots scuffing against the concrete. Greg, still slumped against the wall, scowled as they approached. His breathing labored. "Stay where you are," the older officer ordered, his hand resting near his holster. Greg glared up at them, his lip curling. "What took you so long?" he muttered bitterly. "Your hero here already had her fun." The younger officer, her expression unreadable, pulled out a pair of handcuffs. You're under arrest, she said flatly. Attempted robbery, assault, and resisting arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Greg scoffed, trying to push himself up. Spare me the speech, he snapped. The older officer stepped forward, his tone firm. Stay down. Greg froze, his jaw tightening as the reality of his situation sank in. The younger officer grabbed his arm, pulling it behind his back. The sharp click of the cuffs echoed in the garage as she secured his wrists. As Greg was hauled to his feet, he shot Naya a venomous look. This isn't over, he spat. You think you're some kind of savior? You're nothing. Naya met his gaze, unflinching. You're right, she said evenly. I'm not a savior. I'm just someone who didn't let you win. Greg's scowl deepened, but he said nothing as the officers led him to the cruiser. The older officer paused beside Nia, his expression softening. You did good, he said quietly. I did what I had to, Nia replied, her voice calm but weary. She adjusted the strap of her gym bag, feeling the weight of the night settle into her bones. The officer nodded. Get some rest. We'll take it from here. Nia watched as the officers loaded Greg into the cruiser, his glare still burning through the window as the door slammed shut. The engine roared to life and the car pulled away, its lights fading into the distance. For the first time that night, Nia let herself exhale deeply. Her body ached, her mind was exhausted, but a quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. Greg was no longer a threat. The docks fell silent again, save for the gentle lapping of water against the pier. Nia turned and walked toward the empty street, her steps steady despite the weariness pulling at her. Tonight she had fought, endured, and triumphed not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless. In the weeks that followed, Naya's life became a whirlwind of paperwork and preparation. She sat at her kitchen table, a stack of documents spread out before her, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet room. Each page detailed the events of that night at the docks, written in meticulous, clinical detail. The prosecutor had been thorough, interviewing her multiple times to ensure every moment was crystal clear. Naya appreciated the diligence, but reliving the night was draining. Every question, every clarification brought back Greg's sneer, his taunts, and the raw fear she'd pushed through. You're the key witness, the prosecutor had told her during their last meeting. Your testimony will make or break this case. Nia's fingers traced the edge of a page as she stared at the file. She had faced worse physically, emotionally, but the thought of standing in a courtroom, recounting every detail in front of strangers, still knotted her stomach. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was the prosecutor. Naya. The woman's voice came through, crisp and professional. I wanted to check in before the trial tomorrow. How are you feeling? Nia leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple. I'm ready, she said after a pause, her voice steady. I've gone over everything more times than I can count. Good, the prosecutor replied. You've been incredible through this. Just remember, you're not alone in there, Senpai Mero. Stick to the facts, take your time, and don't let the defense rattle you. They'll try to twist things, but the jury will see the truth. Nia nodded, though the prosecutor couldn't see her. I'll be fine, she said, more to herself than to the woman on the line. See you tomorrow, the prosecutor said before hanging up. Naya set the phone down and took a deep breath. Staring out the window, the evening sky glowed with soft hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She thought of Greg's arrogance, his weak excuses, and every moment she'd felt diminished by men like him, every catcall she'd ignored, every tense walk alone at night. Her jaw tightened. Tomorrow she would face him again, but this time on her terms. The courtroom hummed with quiet energy, the murmur of voices filling the air as people settled into their seats. Naya stood in the hallway outside, her back pressed against the cool, cream-colored wall. Her hands gripped the strap of her bag tightly, as if it grounded her. The prosecutor appeared beside her, her navy suit sharp and immaculate. Nia, she said, her voice calm but firm. They're ready for us. Are you? Nia nodded, straightening her posture. I'm ready. The prosecutor offered a reassuring smile. You've got this. Just focus on the truth. Let the facts speak for themselves. As they stepped into the courtroom, Nia's sharp eyes scanned the room. The jury sat in their box, their faces neutral but attentive. At the defense table, Greg sat flanked by his attorney, his expression a mix of defiance and unease. Nia's heart steadied as she took her place, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to those who thought they could take without consequence. She was ready to tell her story, and she would make sure the truth was heard. In the courtroom, the air was thick with tension, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Paul kept his eyes glued to the gleaming tabletop, avoiding the piercing stare of his attorney, whose gaze cut like a blade. Ryan, unable to sit still, shifted restlessly, his anxiety radiating in waves. Nia, however, was a study in control. Her heartbeat thrummed steadily, a rhythm she'd mastered through years of rigorous training. As a former Navy SEAL, she knew how to keep her composure under pressure. But this moment carried a weight all its own. It wasn't a battlefield, yet the stakes felt just as high. The judge entered, prompting a brief rustle as the room rose and then settled. The prosecutor, a woman with a voice as steady as steel, launched into her opening statement. She painted a chilling picture of the night in question, her words deliberate and forceful. These three men, Gregory Hall, Paul Foster, and Ryan Pierce, thought they could bully, harass, and harm an innocent woman. She declared, her eyes sweeping the courtroom, but they misjudged her strength. They misjudged the power of justice. Nia listened intently, her focus razor sharp, as the prosecutor detailed the terror she'd endured. The defense attorney followed, his tone calm and calculated. He spun a narrative of confusion and overreaction, suggesting Nia's account was embellished. Nia's jaw tightened, but she held her composure, her training anchoring her. When Nia's name was called, she rose with purpose, her steps measured as she approached the witness stand. The room seemed to hush, her presence commanding every eye. Sworn in, she stated her name clearly, Nia Taylor. The prosecutor stepped closer, her voice warm but firm. Miss Taylor, can you tell us what happened that night? Nia inhaled deeply, her eyes briefly catching Greg's smug smirk across the room. A spark of anger flared within her, but she channeled it into clarity. With unwavering precision, she recounted the ordeal, the crude catcalls, the menacing pursuit through darkened streets, the violent confrontation that followed. Her voice, steady yet charged with emotion, filled the silent courtroom, each word striking like a hammer. She described the fear, the adrenaline, and the resolve that had carried her through. When asked how she felt during the attack, Nia paused, her gaze sweeping the jury. I was exhausted, she said, her voice calm but resonant. Exhausted by men like them thinking they can act without consequence. Exhausted by being judged for my appearance, my skin. Her words hung in the air, stirring a ripple of emotion among the jurors. Even the defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. The cross-examination came next. The defense lawyer, his tone slick and probing, approached. Ms. Taylor, you're a trained Navy SEAL, correct? Nia nodded. Yes. He pressed further, his voice almost casual. With your combat skills, isn't it possible you escalated the situation, that your training made the defendants feel threatened? Nia's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. My training kept me alive. If they felt threatened, it's because they chose to chase me, corner me, and attack me. The lawyer faltered, his next question stumbling as the jury leaned forward, captivated. The judge called for a brief recess, and Nia stepped down, her posture unyielding. As she passed Greg, his glare burned into her, but she didn't acknowledge it, her focus fixed on the path ahead. After the break, the courtroom settled into a tense hush. The defense attorney rose for his closing argument, his demeanor polished but calculating. He paced slowly, addressing the jury with a smooth, measured tone. This case isn't black and white, he began, My clients made mistakes. Yes, but let's consider the context. It was a chaotic night. Emotions ran high. They acted impulsively, and they regret it deeply. But should a moment of poor judgment define their lives? He gestured toward Greg, Paul, and Ryan, whose body language told their stories: Greg's defiant scowl, Paul's quiet resignation, Ryan's nervous trembling. These are not career criminals, the lawyer continued. They're men who stumbled, as we all have. Should we condemn them or offer a chance at redemption? Nia's stomach churned as she listened. The lawyer's words felt like an attempt to erase the terror she'd faced, reducing her trauma to a mere misunderstanding. The jury's faces remained unreadable, their eyes flicking between the lawyer and the defendants. The prosecutor stood, her presence commanding as she delivered her closing. Mistakes, she said, her voice slicing through the room. What happened that night wasn't a mistake. It was a choice, a deliberate choice to harass, intimidate, and assault Nia Taylor. She stepped closer to the jury, her gaze piercing. Let's be clear, the catcalling, the chase, the attack, these were not impulsive acts. They were calculated. These men saw Ms. Taylor as a target, a woman they could overpower in silence. When she fought back, they doubled down. She pointed at the defense table, her voice rising. They didn't care about her humanity, but we do. Justice demands accountability, a clear message that this behavior will not stand. She returned to her seat, exchanging a fleeting, resolute glance with Nia. The judge instructed the jury to deliberate, and the courtroom slowly emptied, the tension lingering like a gathering storm. Nia stayed seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap, though her mind raced. The defendants were led away, Greg's glare lingering on her until the door closed. The prosecutor approached, her voice soft. You did everything you could. Nia nodded, her voice steady despite the whirlwind within. Now it's up to them. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and stepped into the crisp afternoon air. The cool breeze brought a moment of clarity. Whatever the outcome, she had spoken her truth of victory no one could steal. Hours later, the courtroom buzzed as the jury returned, their faces solemn. Nia sat near the back, her hands clasped tightly, her heart pounding. The judge's voice broke the silence. Have you reached a verdict? The foreperson stood, holding a sheet of paper. Yes, Your Honor. At the judge's nod, she read aloud, in the case of the state versus Gregory Hall, Paul Foster, and Ryan Pierce, we find the defendants guilty on all charges, including attempted robbery, assault, and aggravated harassment. A collective gasp swept the room, followed by murmurs, the judge silenced with a sharp gavel strike. Nia's grip tightened, relief flooding her as the word guilty echoed in her mind. Greg's face contorted with rage. His jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath. Paul slumped forward, defeated, while Ryan's shoulders shook, his face pale with fear. The judge continued, his tone resolute. Given the severity of these crimes and their impact on the victim, sentencing is as follows: Gregory Hall, as the primary instigator, you are sentenced to 15 years in state prison with parole eligibility after 10 years. Paul Foster and Ryan Pierce, as accomplices, you are each sentenced to 2 years in state prison with parole eligibility after 7 years. Nia exhaled, the weight of the trial lifting slightly, though the scars of that night would linger. As the defendants were led away, she rose, her head high. The verdict wasn't just for her, it was a stand against every moment of fear and injustice she'd endured. Stepping into the sunlight, she felt the warmth on her face and knew her truth had prevailed. And that was enough. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had culminated in this moment. Justice had been delivered, but the wounds, those etched into flesh and those buried deep within, still lingered, raw and unyielding. As Greg was escorted out, his wrists bound by cold steel handcuffs, he cast a venomous glance back at Nia. His eyes burned with defiance, a smoldering ember of arrogance that the guilty verdict hadn't extinguished. Behind him, Paul shuffled along, his steps slow and mechanical. as if the reality of his fate was only just sinking in. Ryan, trailing last, dared a fleeting look at Nia, his wide eyes flickering with a tangled mix of regret, fear, and something almost like shame. The prosecutor approached Nia, her professional demeanor softening into something warmer, more human. "It's over," she said, her voice low but steady. "They'll face the consequences now." Nia rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, her spine straight despite the exhaustion tugging at her. "They thought they could walk away from this," she replied, her tone calm but resolute, each word carrying the weight of her conviction. "I wasn't about to let that happen." The prosecutor offered a brief, reassuring touch on Nia's shoulder before turning to leave, her footsteps echoing faintly in the now quiet courtroom. Nia lingered there a moment longer, letting the gravity of the trial settle over her like a heavy cloak. The gavel had fallen, the verdict had been spoken. But this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, a declaration that no one, no matter how powerful or untouchable they believed themselves to be, was above accountability. As she stepped outside, the crisp afternoon air greeted her, carrying the faint scent of salt from the nearby waterfront. A quiet resolve bloomed within her chest. She had stood her ground, fought to make her voice heard, and ensured that men like Greg, Paul, and Ryan could no longer perpetuate their cycle of harm. The battle was won, but its echoes would reverberate far beyond the courthouse walls. Nia walked slowly along the waterfront, her steps steady despite the dull ache that pulsed through her body, a reminder of the fight that had brought her here. The soft whisper of wind through the trees mingled with the rhythmic lapping of waves against the docks, weaving a fragile sense of peace that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the past weeks. She paused at a weathered wooden bench overlooking the water, her fingers brushing against its rough surface as she gazed out at the horizon. The sun hung low, casting a warm golden glow across the sky. The trial was over. The men who had tried to break her were now behind bars, their power stripped away. It should have felt like a conclusion, a tidy ending to a painful chapter. But to Nia, it felt more like the opening of a new one. Her mind drifted back to the courtroom, to the faces of the jury as they leaned forward, hanging on her every word. She had stood before them, her voice steady despite the memories that clawed at her fear, anger, and the unshakable resolve that had carried her through that night in the garage. She hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for every woman, every person who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or invisible. Her testimony had been a beacon, a refusal to let the darkness of that night define her. It was a promise that no one should have to endure what she had, and that those who inflicted such pain would face the consequences. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her reverie. She glanced at the screen, where a message from the prosecutor glowed. "You were incredible today. This verdict will change things." A small, bittersweet smile tugged at Nia's lips as she tucked the phone away. The prosecutor was right. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about drawing a line in the sand, about proving that the world would no longer turn a blind eye to men like Greg. She thought back to that night in the garage, the sharp sting of his cruel words, the arrogance in his eyes, the way he had underestimated her. Men like him had always existed, cloaked in entitlement, dismissing anyone they deemed weaker, but standing up to them had been worth every bruise, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. It had shown her that strength wasn't just in physical power, it was in the courage to fight back, to refuse to let fear or pain dictate her path. A group of children darted past, their laughter ringing out like bells in the fading light. Nia watched them, her expression softening. This fight had been hers, but it was also for them for the world they would inherit, a world where they could grow up feeling safe, valued, and equal. She sank onto the bench, her fingers tracing the worn grain of the wood as the horizon swallowed the last sliver of the sun. The physical wounds would fade with time, but the deeper scars, those carved by that night and by countless others like it, would linger. And that was okay. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about growing stronger, wiser, and more determined to keep moving forward. As the sky bloomed with hues of orange and pink, A quiet pride settled over Nia. She had stood tall, fought fiercely, and refused to let injustice prevail. The road ahead might be uneven, fraught with challenges she couldn't yet foresee, but she knew now that she was capable of walking it. For the first time in a long time, she let herself feel a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed a reminder that they weren't alone in their struggle. The waves continued their gentle rhythm against the docks, and Nia rose from the bench, her steps lighter, her heart steadier. The fight had changed her, but it had also shown her who she was and who she could become.